Folks, a couple of headlines out of Detroit. The former mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick, is looking for a new day in court. He hopes the U.S. Supreme Court will take up his 2013 public corruption conviction. However, he must wait until Monday to learn if the court will deny or grant him a hearing. The court could also issue a summary judgment and send the case back to a lower court. Last year, Kilpatrick was denied a rehearing request. A three-judge panel upheld Kilpatrick's conviction on 24 counts that included bribery, extortion, and fraud. The 46-year-old remains in prison in El Reno, Oklahoma, serving a 28-year prison sentence. He is scheduled to be released in August of 2037. More shocking news out of Detroit, where former city council president and a journalist, Charles Pugh, has been charged with having sex with an underage boy. This goes back to 2003. This is video from WPIX-TV. Showing U.S. Marshals arresting the 44-year-old Pugh in Harlem yesterday morning. The Detroit Free Press reports Pugh sexually molested a 14-year-old boy who is now 27 years old. They carried on a relationship. Pugh actually was a mentor of the young man. He's charged with 6 counts of criminal sexual conduct involving a minor. Over the last year, at least 3 men came forward saying Pugh hit on them when they were teenagers. Now, no criminal charges were ever filed up until this point. In 2015, Pugh lost a lawsuit to a 17-year-old who said the former city council president was allowed to have access to boys at Douglas Academy without proper protection by the school. Pugh, who now lives in New York City, is expected to be extradited to Detroit in the near future. Folks, a lot of things happening yesterday in D.C. at the Supreme Court. 2 huge decisions. We'll deal first with the affirmative action program at the University of Texas. That program will remain in place. That is after the Supreme Court ruled race can be taken into consideration as a factor during the college admissions process. This case centers around Abigail Fisher, a white woman who sued the University of Texas after she was denied admission to the school in 2008. She says because she was white. Well, the case has gone through several appeals processes. Yesterday, in a 4-3 decision, the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's ruling to keep UT's program in place. The justices say the program is needed, but the university must continue to take a look at its admission policies. University of Texas officials say they are thrilled with the ruling.
Because what it says is that diversity matters. It recognizes that race matters in our society, and it's factored in the appropriate way. It also sends a very powerful message that the educational benefits will help break down these stereotypes that continue to plague our community.
Justice Elena Kagan recused herself because of prior involvement with the case when she was the Solicitor General. Of course, Clarence Thomas, Justice, voted, he was in the 3 who said get rid of the program. It was Justice Kennedy who really was a swing vote there. Joining me now on the phone from Dallas is Texas State Representative Royce West. Also on Skype from New Jersey is Janai Nelson. She is the Associate Director of Counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Joining us here in the studio, Danielle Blevins, the U.S. Supreme Court correspondent. Of course, we still have our panel. First, I want to go to Danielle. Reading this particular ruling, it was interesting because we found out more details about this case. But really, Abigail was saying, oh, these black kids, some Hispanics got in before I did. A lot of white kids had worse grades than her. Who got in?
Right. So basically what we saw in this case was this hadn't really, it said it was about race, but it really wasn't. She wasn't qualified. She wasn't able to compete against these students, and she thought it was because of her race. She's not entitled to these positions. If you look at the classes she would have applied to in 2008, she was competing against, the class had already been filled by 92% by the people who would have qualified under the top 10% law. So you're only competing for 8% of the rest of those grades. So these are kids with 3.5s, 3.2s, and they're actively competing in extracurricular activities, sports, dance, drama, and she just cannot keep up.
And what we also saw here in breaking down this ruling, Justice Kennedy lauded the university for doing as much as they can not to have to factor in race, but clearly said, look, they used many measures. They had no choice but continue using race.
Right. This case really has its origins back in the mid-90s when Texas did have an affirmative action program and it was ruled unconstitutional.
That was the Hopwood decision.
Correct. And so they had to go back to a race-neutral focus. But the thing is, they still weren't getting students. They weren't being able to fill these classes with students of color. So they're like, let's look at this. How do we do this? So they put in different programs just to try to mix it up, and they weren't getting the results. So they went to a balanced program where you do have this top 10% law. You do have this holistic program that looks at more than just grades. Senator
Royce West, I want to bring you in right now. Of course, I'm a native of Texas, quite familiar with this top 10% law. You were one of the folks who engineered that. And what you see here, even though, Senator West, you and others got with rural lawmakers who are white in Texas to pass the top 10%, you still have whites in Texas who don't even like that rule, which is race neutral, saying it somehow helps minority students at worse schools and their students who go to more advanced schools.
That's exactly right, Roland. And don't get it twisted, as we would say. This is a mixed blessing, so to speak. There are those that in leadership in the state of Texas that are now talking about trying to reduce the impact of a race-neutral program like the top 10% as it relates to students getting in. And they're using as the argument is that when we look at the minority student figures, that we don't see a quote-unquote significant number of students going to the University of Texas. Now, that argument is kind of a hollow argument because the reality is that you have more African-American students and Latino students that are accepted, but they don't enroll because of the financial packages that they can get from out-of-state schools like Stanford, Harvard, places like that. And so it's a mixed blessing. You'll see some of those same people that have wanted to see that we turn back the time on the top 10% program go after it again this legislative session.
One of the things that also, when you look at the language that was used in this ruling, to have the court affirm the fact that the University of Texas did try best as they can not to factor in race, but came to the conclusion that they had no choice in order to assure a more diversified freshman class.
Right. That's exactly right. And so when you see that language in there, I hope you use that language, frankly, to kind of hit those opponents over the head as it relates to them trying to turn back the hands of time. And what they will do is say that we should use, we should have more factors taken into consideration in the holistic approach of admitting students. Now, the courts have basically said, the way I read it is that they made a good faith effort, Texas made a good faith effort not to use race by having the top 10% program. And then it used race as a factor in the admissions process. So it's a delicate balance that they will have to meet under what we call a strict scrutiny standard.
Janai, it is not as if this will be the last time we hear of this. There's no doubt in my mind that the groups that funded Abigail Fisher's case will try to continue to attack affirmative action. What is how do you see this from the Legal Defense Fund perspective?
Well, we were thrilled with this victory. We believe that this affirmation of the consideration of race in admissions is the right signal for the country at this moment. This reaffirms decades of precedent, and it demonstrates that the court is still willing to grapple with issues of race and recognizes that race matters, particularly in creating ladders of opportunity, ladders to leadership in this country, that the affirmative action that has created the individuals and successes in the minority community that you see today is still incredibly important now more than ever. And what Texas did here is, as you've been saying, this segment, a factor of a factor of a factor. That was the use of race in this context. Everyone knows that in order to consider race, you have to do it in a very narrow and very prescribed way, and that's exactly what the University of Texas did through the top 10% plan and through the other ways that they attempted in the past to try to get diversity and failed. The top 10% plan in combination with this small and careful, holistic consideration of race is what saved the day here. And we think that it's an excellent signal for universities across the country to be creative in the ways in which they try to achieve diversity on their campuses.
I want to go to our panel real quick here. Twitter had a field day on yesterday. Go to my iPad, Shelly, with the hashtag Becky with the bad grades. They were destroying her on social media after seeing that there were white students that had worse grades than her that got in. That of the 47 students, only 5 were people of color. So she somehow said, oh, it's those 5. They're the reasons why I couldn't get in, but not the 42 white folks who got in who had worse grades than her.
You know, what's striking is that she was a legacy applicant. Her father went to Texas state schools. Her sister, she bragged about the fact that she had many family and friends. She felt entitled to a slot at the University
And keep in mind
of Texas.
that I never hear whites who hate affirmative action complain about legacy, which is the exact same thing. Go ahead.
Right. This is the most important civil rights ruling from the Supreme Court this term. This is affirmation that diversity matters, that black students' lives matter. We're seeing, you know, movements across campuses across our nation. Black students play an important role in the life of a university. We need their voice, and this ruling signals to colleges and universities that they should continue to work to make sure that they have a diverse mix of students on campuses across our nation.
Real quick, Rashad.
Twitter was.
Hold on, Royce. Hold on.
Twitter was hilarious, but this is also a signal that elections matter and that the Supreme Court is still up for on a whole number of other cases, and we've got to get out and vote.
Royce, final comment.
I mean, that's exactly right. Elections matter. And that's why this election is so important, because Republicans are holding President Obama's Supreme Court nominee hostage. We've got to make certain we turn out to vote, because the next president will select a Supreme Court justice.
All right. Senator Royce West, we appreciate it. Thank you so very much. Janai, hold tight right there. Coming up next, folks, we'll talk about the Supreme Court dealing with what may be the biggest legal defeat of President Obama's presidency. We'll talk about what happens with immigration reform next. Also, the Senate is over, but the House Democrats plan to keep pushing for tough gun control laws. We'll talk to 2 Black Caucus members from North Carolina. Plus, at the Entertainer and I have a little fun. And so you guys don't want to miss that, trust me. We talk about it all, including why you can't be ashy. All of that. News 1 Now, TV 1.